I'm Celeste Coles-Fester, Associate Dean for Academic Services at the New School for General Studies. I'm very happy to see you here tonight to hear actually, this is the sequel.
Yes.
A year ago, Gregory Keith, no,
Was it?
year and a half,
Yeah.
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
2 years ago. Why, how time flies. A year ago, Gregory Keith Spence spoke to us and predicted the Obama election. He actually spoke to us on a night when Obama was taking a drubbing. It looked like Hillary was a shoo-in. And this man said, no, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. Well, what he told us was going to happen actually did happen. Now, how did he get so smart? I'll tell you a little bit about Gregory. Gregory is a university professor in professional practice at the New School. He's formerly vice president and general counsel of the university and a senior lecturer in the Milano School. He teaches or is proposing courses in legal studies, ethics, public policy, and in American legal, intellectual, and political history. In his years of legal practice, he has taught undergraduate, graduate, and law students at numerous schools and university, including Boston College, the College of William and Mary, Howard University, and as adjunct professor of law at Cardozo Law School here in New York. Earlier in his career, he was associate dean of the College of Liberal Arts and assistant professor of political science at Boston University and adjunct professor of legal studies at Brandeis University in Massachusetts. Mr. Spence received an AB degree in history, magna cum laude, and Phi Beta Kappa, with minors in philosophy and science from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. During his undergraduate years, Spence was an exchange student at Dartmouth College and a participant in the Harvard-Yale-Columbia Intensive Summer Study Program held at Yale University. He received his Juris Doctorate degree from Harvard Law School. His research interests include modern politics and public policy, including environmental, educational, and health and safety, legal and regulatory issues. Earlier in his career, he was counsel to the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, Committee of what is today the Labor, Human Resources, and Pension Committee. I give you Gregory Keith Spence, who I suppose is going to be a soothsayer yet again.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm going to try to do this in a sort of thoughtful way. The last time I did this, which was February of 2008, turns out that it was 5 days after Super Tuesday. And there was obviously a lot of interest as well as a lot of uncertainty as to what all that was going to mean. And at that particular time, I took a very historical approach to look at what slavery, race, and national politics had been, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. And tonight, I'm going to focus the historical questions more on the 20th century and the 21st century. I propose that we have the discussion in 3 sections, and that each section will try to keep me to 15 minutes or 20 minutes at best, and we'll take a short break in between them so that people will get a chance to sort of stretch their legs or whatever. The topic of discussion for this evening, as you know, is whether or not, or what, let me put it that way, the Obama presidential election portends for future African American national elected officials. In other words, what have we learned? What has it meant? What can it mean? And we are going to look at it from 3 separate perspectives. The first is the historical, or what I call the historian's perspective. And if a historian were to look at voting rights and the activity of voting for Black Americans over the life of the country, the question would be, what would their perspective be on this event and whether or not this event suggests that there will be repetition in future events and additional elected officials. The second section will be done on the political scientific, or what a political scientist would do. Now, a political scientist, in my view, is one who takes an advocate's position. That is, in other words, they make a hypothesis and they determine what they'd like to see in terms of the possible outcome. And then, at least I would argue, that they marshal the facts and they marshal the information of past campaigns and of future campaigns and the like, and voting patterns and the like, in order to argue that this particular outcome can or is more likely or less likely to occur. So the difference, the historian is really sort of looking more at the record and basically says, these are the issues that we have determined, and if I use my quote from George Santayana, those who do not essentially pay attention to history are doomed to repeat it. And so the notion is that the historian often argues the cyclical nature of the observations, and therefore you looked to see whether the patterns hold in the future. And the last section will be what I call lessons learned and an analysis of current and future national political races. And we've got some exciting races around the country that have just occurred, and we are blessed here in New York to have a variety of exciting races, and I'm not too, I don't think I'm giving too much away to say that it may be the interesting case, and hold this question, it may be the case that Harold Ford Jr. has actually answered the question of the evening, and we just haven't thought about it yet. So let's move on and start with the historical perspective, historian's perspective. There are numerous ways in which one can tell the history of the country. You can start with the Declaration of the Independence, the Constitution. You know the story about slavery. You know the story about whether black people were allowed to vote. And you know the story of the Civil War. And you know the story, as we say, when you get up to Reconstruction and the post-Civil War activity. But I thought that there was something very interesting in the sense of the following. It is July of 1776. The Continental Congress is voting on the Declaration of Independence, and it is clear that Jefferson's anti-slavery clause, which was part of his draft of the Declaration, will not be part of the voted and accepted Declaration of Independence. And so we begin the country with the recognition that African Americans are not recognized as citizens, and they are not recognized as able or expected to vote, or able or expected to participate in the society and in the body politic. They are, in fact, a different set of people. The Constitution in 1789 is going to codify this by not even mentioning them. They are only mentioned as other persons. And there are indications that they will be apportioned, and therefore their numbers will be part of the numbers of U.S. House of Representatives, as well as of electoral college votes for the southern colonies or southern states in which they reside in overwhelming numbers. And it is going to be this federal vote, this additional vote that these southern colonies or these southern states have, which will ultimately result in the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800. And so, this, as I've said in the past, the story of the Great Revolution of 1800 that we've been told about the development of the new Democratic Republican Party and how they swept into office and changed the heretofore lock on the office that the Federalists had, leaves out very critical information about the fact that Jefferson received additional, Gary Wills in his book indicates approximately 12 additional electoral college votes. And the difference between his number and John Adams was 8. Okay. The reason I pointed out the time frame is I want you to think about a December day in 1870, which almost 100 years later. On that day, Joseph Rainey of South Carolina will take the oath of office to enter the U.S. House of Representatives. And so, as we look at the historical sweep of these activities, it's going to be important, it seems to me, to look at them in a different set of numbers. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which followed, obviously, the 13th and the 14th Amendment, was instituted in 1870 and therefore gave voting rights to African American males throughout the country. As a result, there were substantial votes in the South, where again the overwhelming number resided, for Republican candidates, because it had been the Republican Congress and the Republican President, Abraham Lincoln, who had recommended these particular activities and were the political force behind them. And during the next 30 years, you will have some representation of African Americans in the Congress of the United States, either as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives or as a member of the U.S. Senate. And that will occur in fits and starts between 1870 and 1901. Interestingly enough, that what happens during this period is also a retrenchment of the Southern Confederate vote, and they will move to remove those voting rights from the African American population, particularly of the South. And so by the turn of the century, virtually every Southern state will have passed a series of black codes and a series of election codes which were intended and had the effect of removing the vote from the African American population. And so, in 1901, the last African American member of the U.S. House of Representatives actually stepped away. Now, as we tell the story of the 20th century, we tend to tell that story as a story of success and progress, and people are very excited. We talk about all of the elections that occurred and the like. But the 20th century didn't begin that way. And there was an interesting argument for the fact that it took almost two-thirds of the 20th century for African Americans to simply regain the amount and the influence that they had in the national office, that is the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate, that they had in 1873. Now, there were no African American members of the House of Representatives from 1901 to 1929. This virtual removal of the vote resulted in absolutely no one returning to Congress, no votes. In 1929, one member returned to Congress, and that person was elected from the south side of Chicago. And it would be that district and that district only that would elect a member to the U.S. House of Representatives until 1945. So there was one black member of the House of Representatives from 1929 to 1945. And an exciting thing happened in 1945. A second member came, and that second member was Adam Clayton Powell. and he was elected from Harlem. And they were, in fact, the only African American members of the U.S. House of Representatives for the next 10 years. So it wasn't until 1955 that you actually had any additional members elected. And as you can tell, those people were being elected from districts that were overwhelmingly or heavily African American. They were minority districts, if you will. Although, if you look historically at the information of Oscar Dupree, the first congressperson who came out of the south side of Chicago, it was more mixed, actually, at the time. He was very involved in the local political machine at that particular point, and it's an extraordinarily interesting story of how he got to be in the Congress in the first place. It would take, quite frankly, it would take almost until 1971 before the percentage of African American members of the U.S. Congress replicated the high water mark of the percentage in Reconstruction. That is to say that in approximately the 1880s, there was 2%. And I think the high number was 5, and a U.S. senator. And that was in 1800, and that represented 2% of the Congress. And it took all the way to 1970, and the numbers were still small, and it was about 2%. So I think it's a very important measuring rod for the historian to argue that, as I said, 2/3 of the 20th century, which we have to some extent experienced and historically been told as this wonderful story of progress and the like, really can be looked at as a period that virtually, from 1870 to 1970, this next 100-year period, that virtually there was static, if not non-significant growth. Okay, what happened in the 70s, which changed this pattern, actually happened in the mid-60s. As I told you, the 15th Amendment of the Constitution invested and created the rights under the Constitution for African American voting. And the United States at that time also passed a number of enforcement acts, which were intended to create federal electors and to actually take action against the Ku Klux Klan and others whose modus operandi was fundamentally to suppress the black vote and to frighten and to lynch and to do whatever was necessary in order to see that there were not any blacks who did, in fact, vote or register or the like. And then the legal black codes came along later and actually created hurdles like literacy tests and the like grandfather clauses and the like, which actually stripped people of those rights if they had in fact operated. Now these are important, but we'll get to it. A troika of civil rights legislation was passed in the 60s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act. And this troika of almost second Reconstruction type actions spurred and created the enforcement mechanism to create voting again in substantial numbers for the African American population. And the important thing to understand historically is that all of the senators and all of the congresspeople in the 19th century were from the southern states. Mississippi, South Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia. This is where the African American population was. And in the middle of the 20th century, all of the people who had been elected to office, who were African Americans, had been elected from either the North, the Midwest, or even California. So the South had been cut out completely. It was not until 1972, actually taking office in 1973, that the first black or first African Americans elected to Congress from the South since Reconstruction were elected, and that was Barbara Jordan of Texas and Andrew Young of Georgia. And what you will find is that the accelerating number of African Americans who go to Congress after 1970 and 71 will be because of the creation of these numerous minority districts or overwhelmingly majority districts throughout the South and throughout the rest of the country. And so the pattern, as you see the numbers go from 11 to 13 to 15 to 17 and the like, you're going to see them coming from the inner cities of the major western, midwestern, northern cities, and also in the South as well, Atlanta, Houston, Texas, and in North Carolina, as I said, and in Virginia. So we are now going to, you now observe up through the current Congress, the Congress in 2009, which has approximately 42 African American members of the House of Representatives and 1 senator, as you are aware. Now, before I end this particular section, I just want to kick off a couple of other details that are important. As you know, in the 20th century, we also had the first phenomenon of African Americans being elected governors of states. You may not know that in the 19th century, there had in fact been African American governors, but they had not been elected. Mr. Pitchback in Louisiana actually was lieutenant governor of Louisiana, and he took office as governor upon the impeachment and removal of his running mate. And then he later appointed himself to the Senate of the United States. And so he, again, was not elected a U.S. Senator, but was in fact appointed a U.S. Senator. The next time that we have a governor, anybody know when that was? 1989. Douglas Wilder is elected the first African American governor of a state in the United States. 1989. How many governors since? No, that's a good answer. That's a good answer. No, you fell for the trap. Where was the trap? The trap is that it depends on the question. What did I say? The next elected governor, and the next elected governor is Deval Patrick of Massachusetts in 2006. Now, we do have another governor, and that governor, like Governor Pinchback, is a lieutenant governor who assumes the office of governor upon the resignation of the governor. In this case, David Patrick, of course. So, so we've actually had, for all, quote, the progress, and for all the suggestions of substantial movement, we've had 2 elected governors. But there's something very interesting about them. And what's very interesting about them is the fact that, I don't know about this, this is going to be very interesting, but the second elected United States, African American United States Senator, who would fill out a full term, the first being Blanche Bruce from Mississippi, is to be Mr. Brooks from Massachusetts, and which happened in the late 60s. And it is interesting because I don't need to tell you that Massachusetts did not have a significant African American population, and yet Mr. Brooks was clearly elected and served a number of terms, and in fact was a well-known and significant a member of the Republican Party. And at one point was considered on the short list for vice president, by the way, as the party was trying to determine who should be the vice president. So it's very interesting indeed that this second elected vice president, second elected governor would be Deval Patrick from the state, or the Commonwealth, I'm sorry, of Massachusetts. And once again, running in the state in which the African American population is relatively small in comparison to the entirety of the state, and therefore could not be looked to as the political basis or the significant basis on which that's selected. Mr. Wilder had a very interesting career in Virginia politics. He had spent a number of years in the State Assembly and State Senate. He was well known, representing a district out of Richmond, which of course was heavily African American. And he was a leading light in the Democratic Party of that time. And the Democratic Party was very dependent upon the African American vote in order for them to win in elections against the Republican Party in Virginia. And the party, the interesting thing in Virginia is that by statute, the governor serves only one term, can't serve 2 succeeding terms. So there tends to be a fair amount of turnaround and turnout in the governor's races in Virginia. And Mr. Wilder, in supporting various governors, Democratic nominees who became governor, announced himself to be a leading candidate for the Democratic nomination for lieutenant governor. And at least if you read the materials that have looked back at this race, there was a very serious consideration that the party was simply in no particular position to offend the African American vote by saying, oh no, you can't be lieutenant governor. So Wilder becomes lieutenant governor. And then when the next term comes up, he announces he's going to be governor. And there really wasn't the political will within the party, it seems, to challenge that. And so in a very interesting show, he then runs for this office in 1989, which had not heretofore. So I just sort of leave you with that, with those information. So what would you say that my final point having to do with historical perspective? The historical perspective, it seems to me, or the historical perspective on this, or judgment, would throw up a caution flag and raise serious doubts as to whether or not one could expect in the near term significant numbers or even recognizable numbers of African Americans to be elected to statewide office and or national office. And the argument that they would use would be because if you look at this history from 1776 to 1870, from 1870 to 1970, from 1970 to now, you're still going to see an extraordinary amount of attempts and conceded activity to suppress and to remove the African American vote. And the question that the historian would raise, at least I'm arguing, the Santayana and those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, is that people who do not look at these activities will then find themselves surprised and shocked when those things are, quote, taken away. And I'll just give you a couple of quick items, and then we'll take our first break. I told you that the Voting Rights Act was essential to the growth of the African American vote throughout the country and on the national scene. The Voting Rights Act has been extended and has continued to provide federal scrutiny of election laws, regulations, and procedures in districts throughout the country, most particularly in southern districts, but not limited to southern districts only, and has required a level of justification for any significant change in election laws in those districts that has ensured that the vote remains vibrant and remains operational. We can point out the voter suppression activities and the regulations that happened in the Florida counties during the presidential elections, both of 2000 and of 2004. We can point to the concerted efforts of the Republican Party to challenge and to ultimately remove federal funding from ACORN, which they have identified as an agent essentially of registering minority and poor voters throughout the country. And there had been a number of suits, a number of challenges, a number of questions raised regarding this. And in fact, as you know, the Congress has in fact removed a significant number of funding for ACORN. But I haven't seen the Democratic Party or other campaigns talk about what kinds of new and expected voter registration activities are going to occur to simply replace, never mind to create more, but simply replace these particular activities. You know that in the state of Florida and in places like Indiana and others, that there have been the use of the voting rolls and the use of what they call the ID system, in which you are going to have to bring in any state or federal ID, including most particularly your driver's license or the like, and they will check to see if you have in fact used the same name or you are the same person who has in fact been to do that to happen. But under the crunch of the registration for the primaries, and also under the crunch for the general election, the secretaries of state of numbers of states have simply frozen large numbers of, it turns out, African American and Hispanic voting registrations on the grounds that it says Gregory Spence on this particular ID or this particular registration, but it says Gregory Keith Spence on another. And so until such time as I figure out which is which, we basically just freeze your vote. There also has been a substantial influence on the numbers of African American votes based on many states passing statutes which basically remove from felons, people who have been charged and are convicted of felons, the right to vote. So when they get out of prison, they no longer have the capacity to vote, and that has had an inordinate effect, again, on the numbers in the minority communities. I point out the Voting Rights Act in this context for African Americans, but recognize that in the Western states in particular, that the Voting Rights Act has also scrutinized the use of these particular items for other minority groups, including Hispanics, and including, quite frankly, Native Americans, which again, one would not think in terms of, but the fact of the matter that in Western states, there are districts and there are places in which they have significant or recognizable ability. The last thing I want to point to is something that I'm really not pleased about, and that is that the Supreme Court of the United States has recently looked at challenges to the Voting Rights Act. I'm talking about as recent as this year, past year. And there has been a signal, if you will, or at least there's an argument that there's a signal, that this particular court is prepared to consider striking down the Voting Rights Act as unconstitutional. And I just would like to end this section by pointing your attention to, in the last more significant case, if you hold on for a second, Northwest Boston Municipal Utility District Number 1 versus Holder, Attorney General of the United States, decided in June 22nd of 2009. The justices determined that they could decide the issue without having to look at the constitutional question. However, there were clear indications that were they to look at the constitutional question, they may in fact have to consider repealing or overturning this particular statute. And I just point your attention to the fact that one lone justice wrote a dissenting opinion, or concurring in part and dissenting in part, that actually laid out the argument for the unconstitutionality of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Can anybody guess who that might have been? No, it wasn't Justice Scalia. It was Justice Thomas. Just think for a second. 1870, 1900. 1900, 1929. 1929, 1945. 1945, 1970. 1970, 2009. And the Supreme Court is seriously contemplating removal, repeal of that instrument which enforced the 15th Amendment to the Constitution and resulted in just the kind of progress that we revel in post the Civil Rights Movement and into the end of the century. The election of Black Mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington. The election of the Mayor of Los Angeles, New York City, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Houston. Just think. So the historian would raise caution And the historian would say, it seems to me, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And those who do not believe that things that happen historically can happen in your lifetime and in your future time, just think and look. Okay, we'll take a, I would say, what, 7-minute break, 5-minute break? 5-minute break, and then we'll go on to what the political scientist or political scientific perspective on these things will be. My argument that the political scientific analysis would probably begin to focus after the Voting Rights Act had been introduced and you began to see this number of individuals who are increasingly going to be elected to the U.S. Congress. And subsequently, at this time, remember that you're also going to see elections beginning of mayors in major cities, for which the black and African American population were larger and larger pieces if they were in the North and also in the South. One of the interesting observations is the fact that, and again, I sort of really hadn't gotten this, but did you know that Atlanta became about 65% African American in the 70s, and that resulted in a unmatched group of African American mayors. And this last election was very close. And one of the big questions was whether or not that was going to happen. And it turns out that the African American candidate actually won again. And so Atlanta has had a black mayor or an African American mayor, whether male or female, because they've had both, since the mid-70s. And interestingly enough, if you look at the race in Houston, what you find is that the African American population percentage of Houston was substantially different in the 70s, and that, in fact, it has diminished, and there has been a growth of the Hispanic population, and Houston is now much less heavily an African American city in terms of numbers, and so it was an interesting difference where the outcome was the opposite, in which a white female beat the leading black candidate for the job in Houston. So there are a number of ways that the political scientists would look at these elections. But you've gathered the question, and the question really is that as a result of both the one-man, one-vote movement and Supreme Court decisions in the mid-'60s, which basically did a couple of things, but more importantly, what they did was to argue that both statewide legislative districts as well as congressional districts needed to be relatively equally organized in terms of the numbers and reflect individuals who inhabited those matters, those places, so that in fact you would end up with, so that people's vote would not be diluted. When you take the Civil Rights Act and you take the Voting Rights Act, this resulted in legislatively with rewritten or redeveloped districts, and there were a growing and increasing number of districts in which the minorities, particularly African Americans, were the majority or close to the majority in those districts. And those operated to be the places at which these candidates would in fact get elected and go to Congress. And so when you look at the growth from, as I told you, the 2 to the 5 to the 9 to the 11 to the 13 to what we have today in terms of 42 plus one senator, which is 43, you will see this increasing number of districts which were drawn and redrawn and protected as a result of the confluence of these particular statutes. The Justice Department's review of any changes that the legislatures and or the state legislatures and or the and the like wanted to do in drawing the districts, and the fact that the federal court had, under one man, one vote, said that it was appropriate for the courts to oversee these items. In other words, these would not be just the subject of legislation whereby the legislators would get together and just decide what would keep the incumbents, but that has been protected. Now, the reason that that's important is because starting about 15 or so years ago, an increasing number of the African Americans who are elected to Congress are now being elected from districts that are not majority-minority. Indeed, there are those who would argue that the trend lines are that these types of districts will be less and less likely, and they're less and less likely because, like I've pointed out about Houston, the populations of the cities are different. And so it is much more difficult and problematic to try and, quote, carve out a district in which African Americans, let's say, would be in the majority, when in fact those districts are now significantly inhabited by Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, people from overseas, and the like. And so you can see why the census of who is where is so critical. And I think that's pretty important. So you remember that back in the 70s, Thomas Bradley is going to shock the country by being elected as mayor of Los Angeles. And the reason that that is so significant is that heretofore, the African Americans who had been elected mayors of significant or recognized significant cities were being elected from cities in which the majority of the population within the city, Detroit, Cleveland, and the like, were either 50% or more African American or within the 40s or the like, so that they would have a significant activity. Well, along comes Tom Bradley, a very popular police commissioner, and he runs and wins as a Democrat in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles has an African American population at the time of something on the order of 18 to 15%. And that was a sort of significant achievement, and it also began a process by which you would have political scientists starting to then look at, well, how are people getting elected in these kinds of elections in which they're not the majority? And that then goes to why I pointed out about the Wilder vote and how he was able to put together a coalition that got him elected governor in Virginia. It's even more interesting to then try to look at what the Deval Patrick experience in Massachusetts was, because in Deval Patrick's case, again, he's dealing with 5%, 5.35% of the population of the state of Massachusetts. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is African American. So you certainly are not wielding significant political power as a result of being an African American candidate. And it is, and if you try to look back at the Brooke Senatorial campaign, it is a little more difficult because Senator Brooke was married to an Italian lady or a white lady, and so he had the circumstance of running with a white wife, and that would be a different, could be and was a different political cut than if he was running with an African American wife, and so therefore this is an African American who is running for governor, as Mr. Patrick was. And if you look back again at his election, recognize that he was in a pretty significant Democratic primary in which there were 3 significant candidates, and he won the 3-way race by getting 49% of the vote in this Democratic primary, and the other 2 gentlemen split the other 50% of the vote thereabouts, one getting about 28% or something, and the other getting about 22% or whatever. So Patrick emerged as the unexpected victor there. The second thing that I want to point to having to do with this area is the fact that during this time, you have more and more African Americans who are getting the kind of experience, political, and the kind of profiles that make them particularly formidable as candidates for elected legislative office. You look at Wilder's political credentials, and Wilder is a terrifically experienced legislator, leader in Virginia, well known in the corridors of power, and understands party politics and the like. And so, having been lieutenant governor and now running for governor, he has an entirely different profile than the profile of the social activist or the activist advocate candidate, which in many instances had been how people identified who ran and who was elected in the African American community in the districts in which they were heavily the case. So in a time when you were looking at a Jesse Jackson running for office on a sort of advocate's platform and agenda, you can see Wilder coming in and running as governor for the governorship with a much different set of credentials, a much different set of experiences, and the clarity not to have an advocate's agenda as his political campaign. So when he got up and talked about what he wanted to do in Virginia, he talked about cutting taxes. He talked about, various other what you would say general issues were, but he didn't come through with a jobs program, and he didn't come through with a, various other kinds of growing government in Virginia in order to provide for people in urban settings and or low-income people. And so as you begin to look at this phenomenon of mayors and of people running for statewide office, I think the political scientists would begin to say that there appears to be various instances in which an African American candidate, if he or she sticks to broad-based issues and does not interject overwhelmingly in their campaign a social justice or remedial agenda, that they can, in fact, find opportunities to actually get elected. And that's the interesting, it seems to me, challenge, because of the fact that during this time frame, for every person who gets elected, we also have elections where at the last minute, Jesse Helms will bring out the race card, and Harvey Gantt will not get elected as governor as senator and then governor of North Carolina. That again, that people come close, and that you have this. And interesting enough, just to not to put too fine a point on it, you will recall that Harold Ford had an extraordinary campaign to be a U.S. Senator from the state of Tennessee. And again, at the last week or so, there was an extraordinary series of very pointed attacks with very racial tones, and ultimately resulted, I believe, in him barely losing that seat. But he had run this extraordinary campaign which got national attention, and for which people began to identify him, having already been a U.S. congressperson, and now he was running as a senator. And it'll be interesting again as we consider these issues, if he does in fact enter the Democratic primary here in New York for the U.S. Senate, how much of that campaign, or how much of that type of campaign material and the like he will present. And it's fascinating. But the point I was trying to make, it seems to me, by this series of experiences, it seems to me makes it more and more difficult, and makes these candidates more and more credible as they attempt to run around the country in these various items. So you're looking at the fact that we've had a number of lieutenant governors in Ohio and obviously in New York, but some people might be surprised to remember that the current chairperson of the Republican National Committee, Mr. Steele, was in fact Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, and that he ran for the U.S. Senate in Maryland as a Republican. Didn't do particularly well, but the fact of the matter was that he certainly had the aspirations, and it appears that the Republican establishment was sufficiently supportive that he made a credible run for that position, and that's pretty important. So I would say that with this growing sense of experience, and people having the credibility based on having run major cities or had major cabinet positions and the like, you actually get candidates which are much more credible to all of the citizens and less susceptible to racial profiling, if you will, or challenge in a certain way, particularly if they are not touting agenda items and or other programs which make them appear to be the same kind of advocates that, as I said, Reverend Sharpton and his candidacy, or Jesse Jackson and his candidacy. But the important thing to note about the Jackson phenomenon is that in many ways it is Jackson's 1988 primary and the potency of his actions that really signal the opportunity that Barack Obama would seize and actually carry out. And that is to remind people that Reverend Jackson ran as president, Democratic nomination for president, And he won 8 primaries and 1 caucus. And at a certain point in the election cycle, he was, in fact, appearing to be the front runner. And there was a great deal of consternation until Mr. Dukakis was able to overtake him in Wisconsin. But he wasn't winning just any place. He was winning the Democratic primary in South Carolina. He won the Democratic primary in Illinois. He won the Democratic primary in Michigan. He won, all of a sudden, this type of candidacy, and the possibility that this could happen, it seems to me, was given enormous credibility. And so one of the things that the political scientists would like to do when you look at the question of whether the Obama campaign represents a different attitude among the voters is to actually look back at the election results and the primary results, that is to say by race and by age and the like, in order to see if indeed whites in 1988 had a certain attitude, and what in the phenomenon that we've seen in the Obama campaign, are we looking at a different set of attitudes or a different willingness, or has something fundamentally changed in order to explain his victory and his, both in the primary as well as in the general election. A study that looks at the question, change or more of the same, evaluating racial attitudes in the Obama era. And he takes significant pains to actually do what I just said, and that is to look back at the voting patterns associated with these particular groups in 1988, and then compare them to the votes in 2008. And you might be surprised that he does not feel that there is substantial evidence for the idea that their attitudes have actually changed that much. And that is as true for whites generally as it is true for 30 and under. That when you look at the 30 and under vote in 1988, and you look at the 30 and under vote in 2008, he's saying that the information doesn't suggest that there was this wild change in attitude, or that there were such overwhelmingly new numbers in terms of percentages who actually voted in one fashion or the other. And that, it seems to me, is very important in trying to analyze what in fact is occurring, or what in fact has occurred, or whether anything particularly in terms of attitude has actually occurred. Another way of putting it is, you analyze the campaigns and you see the outcomes of the campaigns from other forces, like the quality of the campaign versus the money raised by the various candidates, the circumstances, the political, in this case, and certainly in 2008, the economic circumstances, the calamity, the crisis, the capacity of the media to tie one party and one candidate to the woes of the country vis-a-vis another candidate who's coming in afresh, new, and speaking to a different approach. And surprisingly, we might be surprised to note that it wasn't a sea change in attitude by whites, and or whites, whether they were 30 and under, or whether they were in the cohort between 50 and 30, or a significant change in the 55 and over vote. But in fact, it was this synergistic circumstance of these various political activities and of the political judgments that were made in terms of the agenda and the mood of the country and the like, which had a lot more to do with what has happened than people might think. Now, why is that important? That's important because we are now sitting here all aflutter about what Massachusetts did in the last special election for senator, and we are trying to figure out what, in fact, they were saying, or what can one take away, and can you actually take away the things that various people are asserting that this particular population was doing. And I think one of the other things that is important in looking at Massachusetts is the fact that for all of the public information about the difference in the number of Democratic registrants versus Republican registrants, what people were not reporting was that the elections in Massachusetts were being decided by the independent vote, that even together, the Democratic and Republican registered individuals were not the majority of the people running. And so what you saw over the last decade or so of the senators, former Senator, obviously, Kennedy's runs for these offices, where he was, as people remember, working extraordinarily hard, running around the state, very much involved in these campaigns, and people, at least from a distance, would say, oh my goodness, he obviously has it in the bag, I don't know why he's working so hard, and yet he understood that he was really trying to appeal to this independent voter group and not simply whip up the base. It really wasn't about turning out as many of the Democrats as you can. It really was how many of the independents could you get. And so when one looks at the election campaign run this particular time at the special elections, there were those consultants and others who are faulting the Coakley campaign for not paying attention to the independent vote and therefore not ensuring that they were being heard, and in fact left open for Mr. Brown this opportunity to influence them. And by the time people ultimately decided something had occurred, it was too late to bring people in at the last week or the last 2 weeks. And what those people were doing was simply playing to the base. They weren't really getting to the questions that the independent voters had. So, I think that I want to sort of put a semicolon here for the political scientific analysis to say that if one begins to look back over this 25 to 30-year period, the period from 1970 roughly to the turn of the century, obviously, and into 2009, what you have is a whole series of elections at statewide level, major communities, cities, and the like, in which you will have increasing numbers of African Americans who are standing for office, who have a different set of experiences and a different resume set in order to go and run for office. And that whether it's in the city of New York with David Dinkins, whether it's Harold Washington in Chicago, who had been a U.S. congressperson, whether it's people who had been city managers, such as the mayor's first successful mayors in Philadelphia, or Ms. Campbell in Atlanta, you begin to get the kind of profile and the kind of experience that is extraordinarily hard to beat. And these people are much better candidates. They are also much more likely to attract financial support from traditional places. And if they are as good politically as I'm asserting that they are also able to continue to marshal the support of the African American community and thereby make these other communities additives to a very strong base. And certainly a very strong base within the Democratic Party, where the largest concentration, quite frankly, of African American voters are. So we sort of come to the question of whether or not the last 30 years has really been this experience which permits the development of these candidates and these campaigns. And you see it seems to me, the political scientists turning back to the historian saying, well, you may in fact be correct that there are these evidences of significant pessimistic thought, and people ought to be very concerned and keep their eye on the prize about these elements returning, without believing that fundamental attitudes have necessarily changed, and that these elections don't reflect necessarily attitudes having changed. What these elections are reflecting is, in a given space, at a given time, with a given set of backgrounds, materials, financial base, and very well-run campaigns, depending on the issues, yes, indeed, the African American candidate can, in fact, win in districts and in states in which there are not an overwhelming number of African American voters, and therefore it is not the case that they are simply marshaling the majority. So that will leave us with our third and final review, and that review is the question of, so what does that tell us? How does that get you with the future? And I have to say that, thank you to, as I said the other night, I am watching television, and I guess I'm watching, and this was in the morning, and I'm watching one of the MSNBC programs, Morning Joe or whatever, and the commentators there can't wait to ask one of their own, Harold Ford, is it true? Are you going to announce today that you are going to run for this special election in New York? And he smiles in his very smooth and affected way and says, well, I'll let you all know the first time I make a decision or not, but, I have to say that, yes, I have been asked by various people to look at this particular thing, and I think I will take the time to look at it and the like, and I'll get back to you. And I said, in my mind, who asked Mr. Ford to run for the Senate seat in the state of New York?
Harold Ford.
I said, and sort of, what do they know that I don't know? Isn't this the state in which Carl McCall had run for governor, had in fact been the endorsed gubernatorial candidate for the Democratic Party? And in fact, there were those who believed that he neither had complete support of the party, nor did he get complete support of all of the Democratic registrants in the state, which outnumber the Republicans substantially. And so there was this concern that an African American might not, it seems to me, get to be statewide elected. Remembering that McCall had been controller of the state of New York, and therefore had been the first statewide elected official, African American, in New York. Now, I hadn't really heard of anybody who was considering in the years since then, I mean, significant African American political people who considered running for statewide office, like governor or whatever, and was, you know, as surprised as many people were when Governor Splitzer said, "I'd like the minority leader," who David Patterson was. He was a minority leader in the Senate, state Senate of the Democrats. And you know that the state Senate was controlled by the Republicans and had been for many years. And so he was the minority counsel. But he's perfectly good choice. No one sounds like Doug Weiler, doesn't it? Who could object? I mean, so he gets on the ticket as lieutenant governor, and as we all have read and heard, you know, didn't really have in his mind necessarily that, you know, as soon as Spitzer did his 2 terms or whatever, I'm going to announce that I'm going to be governor. But a funny thing happened on the way to the office, and so now he's the governor. Well, he's the former minority leader. He's been in the state Senate and in the state assembly for many years. He's well known throughout the state, known to politicians, the political pundits, and the like. He's been lieutenant governor. I'm not quite sure, you know, how you say, gee, this guy isn't a viable or whatever candidate for the governorship at this particular point. And so, again, I'm trying to make the point, it seems to me, that the political scientist, the political consultant will come at this point and say, yes, indeed, it depends on the circumstances, it depends on the candidate, it depends on the opportunity, and by the way, people win when other people make mistakes, step on their toes, have problems involving corruption, have problems involving, you know, their libido. All of these things can, in fact, unexpectedly bring down your opponent. And therefore, that argues for, well, why don't you look at these particular races and see what you can do? So that brings us back, and the interesting thing is that here in the city of New York, we have just had a very significant mayoral election in which we've had a citywide elected official, the comptroller of the city, run for mayor and ran against an incumbent mayor who was on his unprecedented third term, and quite frankly ran and only lost by 5 percentage points. In an election that, except for maybe the last week or so, there wasn't a really hard racial edge brought to it. It was only up about the last week that started to rumble. And, interestingly enough, the question is, the incumbent mayor, of course, outspent this particular person by multiples that, you know, set historic levels, I would put it that way. And most political analysts will tell you that if you come within 5 percentage points of having won, you can go back and deconstruct that you could have won. And now he has announced, that is Mr. Thompson has announced, that it is his intention to run again for mayor in 4 years. He wants to put everybody on notice. And that has certainly made everybody squirm who have mayoral ambitions in the Democratic Party. But this is a far cry from the city politics after the second, after David Dinkins was defeated in his second election. And only Reverend Sharpton had sort of the broad enough appeal, let's say, or this power and force of name and whatever, to even suggest himself for election, coming from the African American community. Now, I know, since this is being taped, I know I'm going to get in trouble because I know there are Congress people and others who were asked to consider and the like, and I'm not trying to suggest that there weren't and there aren't people who are available. I'm simply saying that the politic in the city did not seem to lean in that direction, and it is a very interesting question. Let me sort of finish. Let me sort of finish here and give you a chance to ask some questions, because I think that it is easier to answer questions about different illustrations rather than give you 35 different illustrations and then have everybody say, okay, well, what do you believe about that and what do you believe about this? Theodore Roosevelt, in one of his great orations, said that, you know, it is better to have essentially tried and failed. And he has greater respect for the man who is in the arena attempting, fighting, rending himself in a good cause and a great cause and failing than in those essentially tepid individuals who live in the gray twilight, he says, that knows neither victory nor defeat. And I think that if you look at some of the information, such as this particular book, there are a number of books out about the election and so forth, but Renegade by Richard Wolff has a series of interviews with the president and his top aides that were taken during the time of the campaign, and it is extraordinary to contemplate where he was through his career as he is making the judgment to run for the presidency, and not in what one would say is a traditional circumstance of, oh, gee, I've got all of this money and all of this support, and, you know, I ran before, and I've got all, you know, and I've got these people calling me and whatever, but I really think this might be the time. This might be the opportunity, and I'm going to go for it. And so you then see glimpses of him when he was a state senator going out to the Democratic conventions, and suffice it to say that he did not have lots of money and lots of support. And the idea is this is a person who has this vision, and then you see him running for the Senate, and it turns out that that Senate race was, you know, the primary, and the other thing was filled with numbers of people and all sorts of things, and he emerges and becomes the Democratic nominee and runs for a Senate seat, which had actually been developing politically from sort of Harold Washington and the Cook County equivalent of people within the city of Chicago, and then married with some additional district and support, and had resulted in the election of the second U.S. Senator in the United States in the 20th century, Carol Moseley Braun's. And so, interestingly enough, we're back at that that district, aren't we? What's going on there in Chicago? how in the 20th century did Chicago and Illinois sort of emerge? And so those of us who are trying to do books and neat articles and so forth are scouring, Illinois and Massachusetts, trying to figure out what's going on. How do you guys come up as the only people who seem to be able to do this in vastly different circumstances? And and then, of course, obviously, as people know, he runs for the Democratic nomination, but he runs against, what people would say at the time, the biggest, most well-known, most well-oiled Democratic candidate that is available. And again, you would say, well, this is not the time. Run next time. Pick off somebody easier. And yet, you know what happened. Whether or not I predicted it completely or not in February, but certainly the feeling the week after 5 days after Super Tuesday was that the knockout blow had not been delivered, and this guy was really in it. And all of a sudden, people had to recalibrate and try to figure out what was going to happen. And of course, what we didn't know is that for the next month or so, he was going to have this incredible string of victories in caucus and primary states, that really propelled him. So that brings me back to the question that you, it seems to me, would want to answer. Whose perspective is more persuasive to you? The historian that looks at the record of events and who, to some extent, believes that those attitudes and ideas that would argue against such candidacies are alive and well, they haven't gone anywhere, and quite frankly, they're actively working every day. And indeed, you would be shocked to know that they can, in fact, be effective. At the same time that people might think, oh, gee, this is sort of a relic of the past. Nobody would ever think that they'd strike down the Voting Rights Act. After all, it's been on the books for how many years now? We've had various extensions, congressional extensions. We've got this long history. But we are watching a court which doesn't appear to be particularly unwilling to overturn precedent and interpretation, even on a constitutional basis. Look at your Second Amendment case. Look at, most recently, the case involving, advertising, what they are calling commercial free speech or the like, and the willingness to do so, particularly with these 5-4s. So don't fall asleep on the fact that that this court is quite capable of coming to such a conclusion, if they will, and one has to take seriously the fact that the one justice who is prepared at this point, I mean, Scalia agreed, concurred with the dissent, but the fact is it was Thomas who essentially wrote the story and has laid out for everyone to see what's available, or what at least he believes is the case if this question comes back, and that's a problem. So, or you then turn to the political scientist, and he or she says, "Gee, there are all these races around the country. Do we just need to get us a good candidate? We just got to get us somebody who we can raise money with. We got to get somebody to do this." And then you turn around and you say, my goodness, here's Mr. Ford. There are front page stories various significant Democratic fundraiser people with national note who are the ones who, in fact, asked him to look at this. He certainly has raised such money before, and the fact when he ran and was successfully a U.S. congressperson, you realize that he has also been in the Democratic leadership in the House. He was part of a group that was involved in looking at congressional races around the country. And so he has been not simply a member of Congress, but he was a leader within the party. And he's been here now 3 years, and people say, oh, well, this is, you know, he ought to be afraid because after all, he's a carpetbagger, you know, right? Except, gee, the senatorial seat in New York has had a number of people who have, in fact, not had significant New York's roots who've come in, not the least of which has been Robert Kennedy and Hillary Rodham Clinton and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. You will recall that Moynihan had been a Harvard professor for many, many years and had gone into the administration and been Secretary of Labor, and then came back, if you will, to New York to run for the Senate seat, and he was not. So I guess the New Yorkers don't necessarily have anything against someone who has national name recognition, the kind of experience that gives them credibility, certainly looks charming and very articulate, thoughtful person, holds his own well on the pundit stage, and doesn't appear to be concerned about the makeup, ethnically, of the state of New York, and the fact that African Americans are a noticeable number, but certainly not 40% or the like, and therefore he doesn't start out with any particular base. In fact, he's going to create his base from all these people who, quite frankly, don't know him, didn't see him, didn't elect him to mayor or something. So he sort of took my whole presentation and turned it on its head when I said, my goodness, isn't this precisely what we are talking about? Isn't this precisely what we want to think is available? And if we don't have people who are prepared to try, then we will never have the victory to look back on, and that become the historical record. Okay. Questions, comments? Please don't throw things. Okay. Oh.
I have a question, Gregory.
Oh, I thought she was. I was waiting for her to ask the question.
You know, okay. Just from the historical perspective.
Yes.
Does that take into account the shifting landscape since the 1965 Immigration Act? We have a very different population, and in fact, the black population that we have in New York is approaching the point where it is predominantly not African American, but immigrant black population. Mm-hmm. And we have an increasing Asian population. We have an increasing South Asian population. The Hispanic population has grown tremendously. So we're not just talking about black and white anymore. And how does that factor in?
Well, that's a very interesting question because of the fact that you will recall that there was a fair amount of attempts during the election of now President Obama, and even in the Democratic primary, to suggest some schism of a type between the Hispanic community and the African American community, and that such a schism could be exploited. And in fact, you know, there were those who were arguing over who had the greatest portion of those communities, particularly Hispanic community, in the primary, and who had to, quote, work and try to convince them that, that he was their candidate too. And it seems to me that, in a real sense, that in the general election, quite frankly, the Republican Party, because of various policies that they wish to have, not the least of which were immigration policies, essentially handed the Hispanic community to the Democrats in this particular item. And they are quite, seems to me, quite comfortably there, not the least of which I also thought that when Judge Sotomayor was nominated for the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, I really expected more Republicans and more conservatives to be touting her, quite frankly, as almost their fine, because she had, in fact, been nominated before for her federal judgeship and then the Court of Appeals judgeship, you know, by First President Bush, and supported by Orrin Hatch and supported by, you know, Republicans for these particular items. And so I sort of was waiting for this sort of, well, you know, you really have picked very well. You picked someone who we already have concluded was, you know, fair-minded, even-handed, or whatever, and the like, and all I saw was more and more digging and more screaming and more, you know, trying to make her to be an extremist based on one or two comments that she made. And I just said, okay, I don't see the schism. I don't think there's going to be one, you know. So I think that it doesn't mean necessarily that the growth of the Hispanic population and or the involvement growth as well of the Asian population does not necessarily portend poorly for African American candidates. But you also have to look, if I was going to play the devil's advocate, I'd look at the citywide races and look at you know, the progress that has been made after Dinkins and the emergence of the in the case of a candidate coming from the Latino community at that particular point, and there are those who believe that in order to get the Democratic nomination, that Mark Green ran such a vicious campaign to unseat the I guess I would say Hispanic or Latino candidate, and that resulted, interestingly enough, in the Latino vote going with Bloomberg, who was running as a Republican and then as an independent. And that was a historic Democratic vote that was now going in that direction, and he seems to have been able to retain it. So it doesn't necessarily settle one way or the other. Yes? Also, if you look at the mayoral race in Houston, because the big significant difference in the demographics of the city of Houston since the 70s has been the great increase in Hispanic population and the Asian population in Houston, which, as you know, is the largest city in Texas and is one of the largest cities in the United States at this point. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation tonight. My question is about, you'd mentioned earlier how sort of the profile of viable non-white politicians is changing with the educational experience, work experience, and so forth, sort of leaving open this mantle for, I guess, people running on more of that social activist background. So I'm wondering who you sort of foresee taking up those types of campaigning or those types of issues, or if it's sort of now of a bygone era and that the types of politicians that are being generated will come much more consistently from establishment, education background, and work experience.
Well, I think it's certainly harder for minority candidates not to have these types of profiles. So if in fact the person is head of a social action group or head of an advocacy group or whatever, and they decide to run whatever minority group that they're coming from, whether it's Asian American or whether it's Hispanic or whether it's African American, I think they are going to have a much more difficult time to actually get to viability than if they are coming from these experience bases and educations and opportunities. When you look at the argument that they said for Deval Patrick was that he stood out among the various people in Massachusetts that he was running against because he not only had a world-class education, he having graduated from, I believe, Milton Academy, one of the premier private prep schools in Massachusetts, but he was also Harvard College, Harvard Law School, and he had not previously run for elected office, but he had been executive vice president and vice president and general counsel of two Fortune 100 corporations, Texaco and the Coca-Cola Company. And so he comes in with a profile of at least experience and capacity to deal with the corporate interest and economic issues that couldn't be matched by people who had been in local government or even in state government. And when you added that he had also been obviously an attorney, a partner in significant firms in the area, and former, in the interesting case that you're talking about in terms of the political profile, of the social action profile, he had been assistant attorney general for civil rights in the Clinton administration. And so he comes, furthermore, he had had a long history of being involved with the Legal Defense Fund. And so he had an established record and knowledge and action in those areas. And so he was a dream candidate. And it bared out. So, I mean, if you look again at the city, you have a new city controller, who first citywide elected Asian American in New York City, and he is certainly building the kind of profile that can get the attention of the rest of us about whether or not this is a person who could in fact run the city, as opposed to coming as an advocate alone, or articulating sort of the outsider's attacks. So, yeah, I think so.
Yes, I think John Liu was going to be the person also. But in terms of, I have to preface my question by saying that I believe in conspiracy theories. All right, so just to identify myself in terms of full disclosure.
You have to put that on the tape of my talk, would you?
So
that's what I need. For
no,
that
this disassociates.
to
This disassociates. I said that in terms of protection, I thought. In terms of Harold Ford and David Patterson,
yes,
who had a nice cozy lunch
yes,
2 days ago.
Yes,
Okay.
the Daily News is very ecstatic about it, I can tell.
Now, here comes my conspiracy theory. President Obama
Yes.
suggested Carolyn Kennedy to fill the vacancy created by Hillary Rodham Clinton joining the cabinet. Normally, this is something that a governor would do for a sitting president, particularly if there's no fantastic choice or alternative out there. Patterson, who was for Hillary Clinton during the campaign,
Right.
ignored the president and went and got an obscure person from upstate. I'm not denigrating Senator Gillibrand, I'm just saying
Right.
she did not have that higher profile. But because she has that lower profile, it allows Harold Ford, who has been here for 3 years and is with the moneymakers and those who can contribute to political campaigns, sitting all in the shadows for 3 years, it allows him to now go against a not too great or high-profile candidate in terms of saying, I'm thinking about becoming Senator of New York. The only thing that Gillibrand has going for her, and again, not to knock her, is that Chuck Schumer.
Not to knock her.
No,
Okay,
I'm just saying in terms of she hasn't been around long enough to do
I
anything.
understand what you're saying, but the problem with that analysis is that it begins. You already have your end. I mean, you're being like the political scientist here. You already have your end. You know what you want to say. And so now you're going back and adding in all of these elements that sort of get you to this end. I mean, the fact of the matter is that she has had the opportunity for more than a year to carry out that office and to get in the public attention, to be known for important issues throughout the city and throughout the country, and to actually, she's an experienced U.S. congressperson, so it isn't that she's inexperienced on the national scene, and she has certainly as every good right to think, the proper platform. So that doesn't get you to the choice of her is really the problem, as opposed to her candidacy and how well she's going to do it and how well you would do it if you did have somebody significant who was going to run against you. Now, as far as Patterson's selection of her, you understand that there were other people other than the Democratic establishment outside of the country, outside of the state, who had an interest in who was going to occupy that seat. And so there was some people pushing and pulling behind the scenes as to who ought to be the selection. So Patterson was getting pushed from a number of sides. And at the time that he made the decision, I at least thought that he was contemplating, this was my analysis, but I'm certain now somebody will tell me I'm wrong about this, but that he was contemplating running for governor. And he thought that he could help his profile upstate by appearing to embrace a very popular Democratic candidate who had won in a Republican district and who would be helpful when he indeed ran for governor, as he is obviously from Harlem and from the city of New York, and he doesn't have but so much of a profile in the upstate community. So the decision itself was not necessarily simply this issue of calculus between what did the president want or what did, at that time, former Senator Clinton want. I mean, the question really, it looked to me as though he made a judgment for himself. which was smart. I mean, which there's nothing wrong with it if it works. If indeed the candidate turns out to do the sorts of things, if you're able to do so. The one thing I want to pass on about Patterson, the fascinating thing about Patterson is I'm not sure that but for his own handling of the governorship and the problems that we have economically and his relationship with the legislature and the like, I'm not sure what the New York, not necessarily whether there are other candidates who are interested, but what the New York populace would necessarily do with him if he was in fact running. In other words, I'm not sure that they would make this sort of race calculus given the experience of the fact that he had in fact been all of the things that I ticked off. They were used to it, they understood it, they had seen him, they knew his policies, they knew what he was doing as governor, they knew the appointments that he was making, and so forth. So even in this instance, it's not as though the opportunity to run for re-election in this case, or election, would be such a bad idea on these sort of traditional notions of, oh, gee, they haven't really voted for a governor in the past. So, who is an African American? Put it that way. Yeah, sure.
Okay, I have a question about Harold Ford.
Yeah.
Do you think he came here after his defeat in Tennessee just to take advantage of the opportunities of New York City, or was he brought in here by a small group of moneyed elitists on Wall Street and sort of put on the bench and groomed and said, you know, wait for the opportunity, and then we'll put you in, and you'll go down to Washington, and you'll be our spokesperson. You'll be the senator from Wall Street.
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think that 3 years ago, when he got the job and the opportunity, and he brought his new wife, and he came to New York City, I'm not sure that he particularly thought about it one way or the other, or that anybody else thought about it one way or the other. And the interesting fact is that I do have a copy of an article in which they've got these four major fundraisers, Democratic fundraisers, who have been giving money to Democratic Party candidates and causes for some substantial period of time, and apparently at least two of them are named as people who were the people who contacted him and said, you ought to think about it. And I'm not sure that this is more than a calculation of how good a candidate they think she may be. Now, remember, 3 months, not 3 months ago, 3 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, we were all waiting to see which one of the old venerables from the Republican Party were going to name that race. And we watched as former Governor Pataki and the former Mayor Giuliani both passed on not only the governorship, but also passed on the Senate race. And I said, I don't know, I don't know what they know, but that doesn't seem to me as though they have come up with a, you know, very strong traditional sort of Republican candidate to go to this. And so maybe this race is now, whoever wins the Democratic primary may in fact have a pretty reasonable go of it. We don't know. And the reason we don't know is because after the Brown victory in Massachusetts, people are now saying that the conservatives and or the Republican office holders can in fact be people who are not the traditional powerhouses, that new fresh faces can actually emerge. So we don't know who in New York in the state Senate or whatever might emerge, or what new corporate head might decide to pick up that mantle and really make a race of it. So right now, the real question is, I think that people are saying, let's consider a debate. Here's Senator Jill Rand, and there she is behind the podium, And here is Harold Ford Jr. And you're trying to figure out what the voter who's watching this on television is going to think about this. And New Yorkers are well-educated, very serious about their politics, want to look good, expect their people to be sharp, expect their people to be photogenic and, you know, project a national image. And these guys could say, I think Harold can beat her. I think the public, I think the New Yorkers will turn and say, that's my guy, you know, and so forth. And, very interesting. So here we are at the beginning of the prospects, and I just don't know. But the incredibly interesting thing for our question, or my analysis of whatever, is this an illustration of precisely the question, the answer to the question that we wanted? We wanted to feel that we were at a time and in the country where there is no special barrier to running a successful campaign for statewide or citywide, statewide or national office by an African American candidate, when one takes into account all the vicissitudes that any normal candidate will have as to whether or not they get elected or not. You got to pick the right person you're running against. You got to have the right pedigree. You've got to have the right financial backing. You got to get the issues right. You got to not make mistakes in the debates. And the country seems comfortable enough with bright, well-educated people of whatever background. That's who we want in government. That's who we want to try to fix things. And so yeah, go for it. What do you got to lose? Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you for this compelling and interesting presentation. In part of what you're saying is also there's a certain alchemy of influences that can't be accounted for and will converge to make for a successful campaign. And I'm reflecting back on how the Obama campaign was one of the first real 21st century campaigns that used this amazing new technology, the internet, to put forth a campaign. And now I'm asking you to put your soothsayer hat back on to share with us what impact you think, if any, the development of the internet and access to and exposure through the internet may also play or not play in our democratic process and the opportunities for game-changing in campaigns.
Well, I think that it has tremendous opportunity because you have a rising generation of people who communicate in that manner for all sorts of reasons. And so, without sounding pejorative about the 30 and unders and the 40 and unders, that generation of Americans is so committed to communicating through those forums, those mechanisms, that one can only see increasing, impact by political people who understand how to get their message out there, how to have these people engaged. The interesting idea that because of this form of communication, I don't know that in the past anybody who gave something as small as a $25 contribution to a national figure felt as connected to the campaign, felt as watched and and ask their opinion and ask them to send me your answers to this question and what do you think he ought to say? And by the way, 2 weeks from now, there's going to be a rally of such people at the local restaurant or or somebody's home if it's a suburban community or whatever, and sign up and get involved and this kind of stuff. And I just think that it really has the true capacity to I don't want to say revolutionize, but grassroots support. It seems to me over the next 25 years is going to be immensely connected to the capacity of the politicians and or advocacy groups and or unfortunately and or the corporate groups that are hiding behind these grassroots efforts to influence people and to get them to feel connected. Now, I do have an interesting criticism of what is happening with the off-year elections. There seems to be a willingness on the part of the Democratic Party and, to some extent, the president to concede the primaries and the vote for these congressional seats to the narrow groups that tend to vote for them most of the time, which generally tends to be a more conservative element and the elderly and the like, and less of the 30 and unders, the minority groups, the liberal activists and the like. And so I was half expecting, or certainly looking for, some new increased efforts at voter registration for the Democratic Party in these groups, sort of whipping them up, saying, yes, it's important now that you have to not simply vote in the presidential elections, but it's absolutely necessary that you vote in the congressional elections in order to protect the congressional numbers that are going to have to be maintained in order to get the policies that you voted for enacted. And so rather than us, right now, to some extent, we're running around looking at Massachusetts and saying, oh, gee, that handful of independents in Massachusetts, we're now acting as though, oh, they are now the touchstone for everybody, every race throughout the country, and that we have to play to them. We have to convince them because the others aren't going to be involved. And I particularly, being on a college campus, I'm particularly interested in, again, the 30 and unders understanding that you got to be in it now. You can't wait until 2012 in order to say, okay, if he runs for re-election, now we're going to come back in it and say, yes, we want health care, or yes, we want climate change, or yes, we want energy policy or that. And I think, to some extent, that's what has happened to health care, that we've sort of just backed off again and sort of said, well, so now every pundit is saying, oh, yeah, well, the majority of the people don't want it, because you realize that these surveys are done with about 75 people, 100 selected people. There's no real canvassing of a substantial portion of the society. Yes?
I was just wondering if you worry that we could have in the future sort of both of the realities that you talk about, the political scientist and the historian, because you could end up with a situation where you have diminishing voter rights and then elected officials who are minorities, but they can't represent the people that they would like to represent because they have to keep this
Well,
you know.
I have colleagues who are economists and are sociologists and the like who are very concerned and interested in the issues of what they call social and economic justice and the like, and they are preparing to roast me in a couple of debates in the next few weeks over just precisely that issue. But however, they're going to come at that issue from the perspective of why should the minority community give their vote to candidates, even if they are minority candidates, if they are not carrying out the types of social and other change that they wish to see? Aren't they supposed to be looking for candidates who are going to consider that? And when you have a very interesting candidate, look at the mayoral race in Houston and see the difference between the leading black candidate who ran against the white female who ultimately won, and look at the difference in what their candidacies were about. In other words, what sorts of things they spoke to. And it may be that her campaign was more progressive in certain important ways than his. And there was a very interesting question when you are not picking on the basis of someone's ethnicity and or gender. Well, what do I do if the female candidate comes out and she's, got this profile? And it's very interesting the way the politics are done, because you remember in the upstate New York congressional seat, the one that is literally the last district before you go into Canada, the woman who was running as the Republican Party's candidate, had a very progressive set of campaign, her plans. So progressive, in fact, that essentially the conservatives, the Tea Partiers or whatever, ran against her, a person who was not a Republican, to be the Republican candidate, and ultimately elected the Democrat by siphoning out, and she quit. You remember, she dropped out of the race at the last minute to keep from splitting the vote, and she endorsed the Democratic candidate. So there's going to be a lot of this kind of thing, but I think that they have an interesting question.
And it's almost more about class, maybe. I don't know.
Well, I think part of the problem is the same problem that we've got about what time is it. And in a time of serious economic downturn, and a time when the government and the economy is going to be scrambling for funds and scrambling for these things and whatever, it is going to be hard to have an agenda that asks government to grow, to provide basic services, or to make up for the absence of basic services in various communities. It is extremely hard, and I'm not sure that you're going to get a lot of candidates who are going to be, running to say, I'm, for extending this and extending these kinds of benefits or whatever. Yes?
I'm thinking about the Houston election again.
Yes.
And, I think that was more than a black male candidate and a white female candidate. I
Yes.
think that this particular white female candidate was, in her way, a minority candidate. She was a lesbian who has a black child, so that it wasn't just choose up your sides racially, that she in her own right was a minority candidate, so that the choice was between two minority candidates really in that election. And I have no idea how close the election was. Does anyone happen to know? But and you have the fact that the black candidate played on some homophobia toward the end of that, so that that became a little ugly.
Yes, which is why I use the term progressive in terms of what kind of campaign she may have been running and what she was willing to say in terms of these issues. And coming from, in her sense, an authentic knowledge base and interest and support for civil rights, non-discrimination, government operating in a certain way and providing services, children's services, whatever. I mean, she could well build a very strong, authentic campaign interest in that way. And if you have somebody coming from the other side and pushing against this, and therefore not suggesting this to somebody's great surprise, oh, here's the African American candidate who's not interested in extending services, doing these other things. But look at some of the things that Harold Ford has actually come out for. He's really making himself an alternative to a very progressive platform and raising the question of whether, again, he will be a better candidate for election because he is moving more to the middle and more to the center, and not sort of being another replication of a liberal New York City-based candidate. And it's very interesting because she has been caught in having to move away from some of the more conservative positions on gun control and other things that she had taken when she was, in fact, the Democratic candidate, but in a very conservative Republican-dominated district. And she took these positions, but now that she's senator, and has to deal with the national scene and
now
sort
she shows up at Sharpton's headquarters.
Yes, so these are real questions, and wouldn't you love to be, sitting in the room with the candidate turning to you saying, okay, you're the political consultant, tell me which way should I go? And, and you better be right, because if I lose this, your name is mud for, you can forget it. No problem. So I just think that it is going to be a more interesting and difficult time for people on different sides of these heretofore social and political and economic issues. And if you will recall that in the State of the Union address, the president had a line that said, in essence, that the education programs that he was putting money into and supporting public education, public K-12 education, and trying to establish and make sure that the young people have the opportunity and indeed the experience of a first-rate education to start their lives off with. There was literally a line that said, this is the most important anti-poverty program. You remember that line?
Yes.
Interesting, because obviously you're trying to focus those people on, no, this is actually the better way and maybe the only viable way to have those kind of programs. You can't come up now and say, oh, gee. And those who are running around saying these job programs, what the job bill ought to do is create a whole lot of federal and state local jobs. A number of years ago, the federal government, in an attempt to provide unemployment for people, particularly people on welfare and whatever, was to create jobs and fund them at the citywide level and whatever. And there was this job corps, and all these people had these jobs, going around picking up trash and doing these various things. And all that sounds good and well when the economy is doing well, and and you get record revenues coming in from Wall Street and corporate America, and you're not at war and all of these wonderful things. But you can see the fight that's going to happen with both governors and mayors and and the president, when they're all worried about how big their deficits are going to be and how sustainable they are and how they can do it without raising property taxes or raising taxes in some other way and get caught doing that, and at the very same time, you know, they can't afford to have make work around the city hall, you know, doing restorations, you know, or something like that. And by the way, those jobs will go away as soon as the next election cycle goes. So.
Any more questions, anyone?
There's got to be somebody who wants to give us a good comment so we can close it off and
Since you mentioned the economy, why do you think the president has not harped on the fact that the deficit was an inherited deficit, outlined how and why it was inherited, and then move forward from there? Therefore, here are my plans. Because right now he is allowing himself to be subjected to the, quote, deficit spending, which is what you were talking or alluding to. And it just seems, I'm just perplexed why such a brilliant politician, a brilliant guy, doesn't take the obvious perspective and say, hey, first of all, let me just tell you what this mess is, how we got into this mess, who really caused this mess. Now, listen to my plans for getting out of the mess.
My answer is, who's the quarterback for Minnesota Vikings?
Brett Favre.
Brett Favre. That's my answer. You're Brett Favre. Everybody's watching you. Your star running back, Mr. Peterson, has fumbled the ball 3 times. Okay? You need him. You got to keep going. You got to try to keep these guys from taking advantage of this. And everyone's watching you. Now, you go in the huddle, or you go on TV and say, this isn't my problem. I'm just the quarterback. I hand off the ball. This guy is supposed to be one of the great running backs in the game. He's supposed to be making 200 yards per game. This is the biggest game of our lives. He has screwed up. Don't you all remember that? Answer, no. No one remembers anything other than at the end of the game, near regulation time, he takes one chance. He threw across his body. He should never have done that. The fact that he's a Hall of Fame quarterback, that he's got more touchdowns than anybody, none of that matters. He made a mistake. So, you're the president of the United States. You get up in the morning. You get up on the horse. You cannot turn to the public and say at that point, this isn't my horse. I inherited this horse from the previous guy. I haven't had a chance to pick my horse. You know, after the inauguration, it's your horse. We completely suspend disbelief, completely forget, and nobody says a thing. It's your horse. So that's the reason why the pundits will never let him do it. If he said it, they would be complaining bitterly that all he's doing is the old saw and so forth and so on. And I thought when he said the 3 things that made sense, I saw nobody react. He said, a prescription drug bill, 2 wars, no money for either of these. There's your deficit. And no one said a word. But what are you going to do?
Okay, on that note.
Okay. Brett Favre.
Thank you.